Pull her plug. That is what my daughter hissed, thinking the machines were louder than her own spite, thinking that unconsciousness meant deafness, thinking she could finally have me vanish without the inconvenience of a funeral or the awkwardness of grief. Those 3 words didn't sound like mercy. They sounded like a sentence already rehearsed, as if she had practiced them in her car, rolling them on her tongue until they became a single smooth blade. I lay there, eyes closed, the fluorescent light pouring through my eyelids, and felt a tremor of cold spread through my veins, not from the IV, but from the knowledge that the child I had fed, clothed, defended, and bailed out of her own mistakes for decades had become the person trying to sign me away like a patient left too long on hold. I am 82 years old, and yet in that moment I felt both ancient and newly born. Because when you overhear your own death sentence spoken with the familiarity of a nickname, you understand at once how long the ground under you has been eroding without you noticing. I live now in a sunlit private room on the top floor of a hospital wing that carries my name on a small brass plaque. A wing my daughter must have walked past countless times without lifting her eyes, because she never noticed whose money built the walls she hoped would swallow me. The nurses here greet me with the kind of careful kindness that is not pity, but professional respect, the way people speak to a woman who has survived both a stroke and a betrayal. Every morning, they open the blinds and let the east light in, soft and pale, and I think of how many mornings I rose before dawn to iron uniforms and make lunches, believing sacrifice was a kind of inheritance my children would one day understand. It is strange to wake up and realize the legacy they were waiting for was not my lessons, not my recipes, not my stories, but my silence and my money. I remember the way she leaned over me, her perfume sharp and sweet, the way her hair fell forward like a curtain as she spoke to the doctor, the little tremor in her voice, not from sorrow, but from impatience. She wouldn't want to live like this, she said, as though I had ever confided such a wish to her, as though the woman who had fought off creditors, cancer, and the shame of her husband's debts would suddenly want to bow out because of a few tubes and a machine. The doctor's pause was long, deliberate. He glanced at my chart, at the directives I had updated the year before without telling Elaine, and then he said, very quietly, "She funds this entire wing, and your band." It was not just a rebuke. It was a door closing with a soft but final click. I heard my daughter's gasp, a sound like a balloon losing air. I wanted to open my eyes right then and look at her, but something in me held still, wanting to see how far she would go once she realized she had been seen. They moved her out of the room. There were footsteps, hushed voices, the metallic hum of machines keeping time. I lay there, skin paper thin, body heavy as wet sand, but my mind sharp and lucid. Memory became a reel spinning too fast. Every loan she called a gift. Every holiday visit cut short because she had other plans. Every time she told me to sign something because it's just a formality. I had built a life of forms and formalities for her, thinking I was making things easier, thinking I was protecting her from the hardness I had known. In truth, I had been handing her the tools to erase me. It is a strange thing to be awake in a hospital bed and feel not terror, but a kind of grim curiosity. What happens to a woman when she stops believing she is indispensable? What happens when the child she would have died for tries to make that death a matter of convenience? I felt a pulse of anger, yes, but beneath it, a cooler, older emotion, clarity. The same clarity that made me open my first savings account at 19. The same clarity that taught me to smile politely at men who underestimated me while I negotiated a better deal in my head. I thought of the accounts Elaine did not know about, the ones I had kept small but steady, the ones she would never be able to touch. I thought of the scholarship fund draft sitting in my lawyer's drawer, waiting for my signature. And I thought of the hospital wing, my name etched on its cornerstone, the irony of my daughter trying to extinguish me in the very place I had built for other people's mothers to survive. When the nurses came back to check my vitals, I kept my eyes closed. I wanted the silence to stretch, to see if Elaine would try again, to see if she would return with crocodile tears and trembling hands, to see whether she would spin the story differently once she realized she had been stopped. She did not come back. Instead, a younger voice whispered near my bed, "Grandma, can you hear me?" It was Ben, her son, my grandson. His fingers brushed mine, tentative, as if touching a ghost. "Mom says you're sleeping," he murmured, "but I know you're still in there." The weight of his palm on the back of my hand was like an anchor, pulling me back to a world I wasn't ready to leave. I drifted between sleep and waking for hours, maybe days. Time in a hospital stretches and folds like paper. But through the fog, I could hear small fragments. Nurses talking about how I was stable, a lawyer's name spoken softly, the shuffle of papers near my bed. Somewhere, a decision was being reversed. Somewhere, my life was being handed back to me. I imagined Elaine outside, pacing, furious not at what she had tried to do, but at having been stopped, already rewriting the narrative in her head, already preparing the next performance of concern. And for the first time in years, I felt not dread, but anticipation. I am telling you this now from a chair by the window. The machines are gone. My legs tremble when I stand, but they still hold me. The doctor who refused her order came in yesterday and asked how I was feeling. I told him the truth. Like a woman who just woke up from someone else's dream. He smiled, but didn't press. Outside the window, the morning light hits the wing's brick facade, making it glow the same color as the peaches my mother used to slice for me as a child. I think of her then, of the way she used to say, "You can give and give, but never give away the right to decide your own ending." I had forgotten that for a long time. Elaine counted on me forgetting. She counted on me being too weak or too docile to notice the paperwork, the whispers, the cold hand on the plug. But I am still here. And I have heard everything. The catalyst was not the stroke itself, though that was what everyone would later call it. The incident, the event, the polite medical euphemism that made it sound like a hiccup instead of a near execution. The true catalyst was the moment I realized my own daughter had been waiting for the first sign of weakness to translate it into opportunity. A stroke is a storm in the brain, but betrayal is a storm in the blood, and mine had been building quietly for years, darkening under the surface of every small favor, every signature, every trust extended too easily. When I woke up in the ICU, there were flowers at my bedside, expensive, tasteless, the kind that smell like money and apologies, and a card with her careful handwriting. "Rest easy, Mom. Everything's under control." That phrase, "everything's under control," made my skin crawl, because I knew whose control she meant. The day the stroke happened, I was in my garden clipping roses. The morning was hot, and the air smelled of soil and salt from the ocean, and I remember thinking I should have watered earlier before the sun reached its full height. My neighbor had waved, calling out something about a bake sale, and I had lifted my hand in answer, feeling perfectly ordinary, until the shears fell from my grip, and I saw my own hand trembling like it belonged to someone else. I remember the ground shifting, the way the colors seemed to drain from the world, and then the wet grass pressing against my cheek. I woke up 2 days later under hospital light, my tongue thick, my speech slurred, but my thoughts intact, sharper than they had been in years. Elaine was sitting in a chair by the window, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, startled, as if caught doing something private. "Oh, thank God," she said, her voice too bright, too rehearsed. "You're back." She took my hand, squeezed it lightly, and I felt nothing of comfort in it, only calculation. It took only hours for the doctors to stabilize me, for the swelling to ease, for the fog to lift enough that I could follow conversations. What they didn't know was that I could also follow silences, and silences tell the real story. When they thought I was asleep, Elaine would lean close to the nurse's station, her tone clipped and confident, asking about long-term prognosis, about quality of life, about options. I could hear the doctor answering with measured patience, the way men speak when they know they are being tested. The phrase persistent vegetative state was used once, then withdrawn, corrected, reshaped into something less accusatory. She wanted to sound like a loving daughter considering mercy, not an impatient heir calculating time. That afternoon, I caught fragments of her conversation with the neurologist. She was standing just outside the curtain, and the doctor was explaining that my vitals were stable, that the EEG showed promising signs. Elaine interrupted, her tone sharp. "But she can't really recover, can she? Not to her old self." He hesitated. "We can't know yet. There's brain activity, responses to stimuli." "But she wouldn't want this," she said quickly, as though rehearsing a line she'd been preparing. "She always said she didn't want machines keeping her alive." That was the lie that changed everything. I had said no such thing. I had said once, years ago, that I didn't want to live without dignity. Dignity is not the absence of struggle. It's the presence of choice. But Elaine twisted that into a permission slip. I could hear the doctor leafing through papers, then a pause. "Mrs. Carter," he said evenly, "your mother's advance directive is active, and it doesn't say that." Another pause, and then his tone hardened slightly. "It names a different agent for medical decisions." There was a silence so deep I could almost feel the shape of her shock. "Who?" she asked, her voice thin. "Your mother appointed Attorney Grant Field as her proxy 2 years ago," he said. "And for the record, Mrs. Carter, she also happens to be one of the principal donors to this hospital. So unless he authorizes otherwise, nothing will be disconnected." What followed was chaos disguised as composure. Elaine thanked him stiffly, left the room, then came back half an hour later with a trembling smile and a cup of lukewarm coffee, as if the earlier conversation had been a misunderstanding. "How are we feeling today?" she asked the nurse in the kind of tone that pretends warmth while demanding obedience. The nurse answered politely, but her eyes met mine, and I saw in them that she knew exactly what had happened. The rest of the day moved in a blur. Tests, adjustments, whispers. Elaine came and went like a restless ghost. Every time she stood by my bed, she would glance at the machines as if she could will them to silence. That night, I drifted in and out of sleep, hearing voices from the hallway, a nurse laughing softly, someone paging a doctor, the rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor steady beside me. Around midnight, I woke to see a man standing by the door, the doctor from earlier. He thought I was still unconscious. He looked at me for a long moment, then adjusted the drip on my IV and said quietly, almost to himself, "Don't worry, Mrs. Carter. You're safe now." His words reached me like a thread of light through fog. Safe. It was a word I hadn't associated with my daughter in years. The next morning, Elaine arrived with fresh makeup and a folder of papers. "Just insurance forms," she said briskly. "Routine." My hands were still weak, but my mind was sharp enough to recognize the outline of a power of attorney document, even upside down. "You can sign when you're ready," she said. "We need to keep things organized." I stared at her hand, resting on the folder, her nails manicured, her smile brittle. "Later," I murmured, pretending fatigue. She patted my arm with mock tenderness and left the room. The moment she was gone, I pressed the call button. When the nurse came in, I asked for my lawyer. My voice was rough, but steady. "Tell Mr. Field I'm awake." She nodded once, professional and calm, but there was a flicker of admiration in her eyes, the look of someone who has just witnessed a person clawing their way back from both coma and betrayal. By noon, Grant arrived. Tall, silver-haired, methodical, he looked more like an old friend than a lawyer. He greeted me with genuine warmth. "You gave us quite a scare," he said softly. "I suppose I did," I replied, and my voice sounded stronger than I felt. I told him everything, what I'd overheard, what she had tried to do. He took notes without interrupting, then folded his notebook and said, "We'll take care of it, but you need to rest." I smiled thinly. Rest can wait. This can't. That was the first moment since the stroke that I felt alive, not merely in body, but in will. When Elaine returned later, expecting to find me pliant and medicated, she instead found Grant seated at my bedside, documents neatly spread out. The color drained from her face. "Mother, what's all this?" she asked, the sugar gone from her tone. "Just paperwork," I said, echoing her earlier lie. She looked from me to Grant, understanding dawning too late. "We're updating some authorizations," he said smoothly. "From now on, all medical and financial decisions go directly through my office." Elaine opened her mouth, closed it, and turned to me. "I was just trying to help," she said. Her voice trembled, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or fury. "I know," I replied quietly. "You just didn't expect the machines to listen better than your conscience." That evening, when the sun fell in orange sheets across the ward, I asked the nurse to turn off the television. The silence that followed was the most peaceful I had known in years. I could hear the rhythmic sigh of the ventilators down the hall, the distant rattle of carts, the whisper of a mop on tile. The world was still turning, and I was still in it, despite my daughter's attempt to pause it. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. The stroke had not taken my power. It had revealed it. My daughter had mistaken my stillness for surrender, my aging for absence, and my generosity for weakness. But lying there, surrounded by machines she had hoped would fall silent, I felt an awakening deeper than any physical recovery. She thought she had come to close my story. Instead, she had written herself out of it. When they transferred me from intensive care to the rehabilitation ward, the curtains were a softer shade of blue, and the walls painted a kind of optimistic beige, as if color itself could coax people back toward usefulness. They wheeled me down the corridor past rows of rooms where televisions murmured daytime shows to people who were too sedated or too alone to protest. I remember thinking that hospitals were the only places where the sound of life and the smell of disinfectant could coexist without apology. My daughter had not returned since the morning she was escorted out. She had sent one perfunctory message through the nurse's station saying she was taking some time to process the trauma of nearly losing her mother. The irony of her phrasing might have made me laugh if my throat had not been so raw. In her world, my continued existence was the tragedy. The days fell into a slow, deliberate rhythm. I learned to walk again in careful inches, pushing a chrome walker across polished floors, watched by a physical therapist named Marco, who had the patience of a saint and the eyes of someone who had seen too many families come apart under the fluorescent glare of recovery. "Don't rush," he would say. "You've got time." I wanted to tell him that time was the one currency I had never spent frivolously, that I had built a life of schedules and sacrifices, that I had raised a daughter who believed every hour of my life belonged to her convenience. But I only nodded and kept moving, because what I needed now was not confession, but endurance. At night, when the ward quieted and the machines settled into their nocturnal hum, I began piecing together what had happened in the days I had lost. The nurses filled in small details without meaning to. The way Elaine had arrived in designer heels and left in fury. The whisper that she had tried to access my financial files while I was still in the ICU. The rumor that a man in a suit had delivered legal papers on her behalf and been turned away. Each fragment was another stitch in the quilt of understanding. She had not simply panicked. She had planned. And yet, as strange as it sounds, I did not feel hatred. What I felt was a deep, steady grief, not for the act itself, but for the years of quiet blindness that had allowed it to happen. Grant visited often, bringing updates from his office, his tone calm but edged with disbelief. "Your daughter has been calling," he said once, glancing at me over the rim of his glasses. "She's claiming you were confused when you signed the directives. She's implying you were manipulated." I smiled thinly. She always did prefer a world where the truth was an opinion. He chuckled, not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only polite substitute for outrage. Together, we began revising every document she had ever touched, disentangling my accounts, closing old joint signatures, creating new protections. The process was meticulous, bureaucratic, oddly satisfying. Each form I signed felt like a small resurrection, a reclaiming of the self she had tried to certify as obsolete. There were mornings when I caught my reflection in the window and did not recognize the woman staring back, hair thinned by illness, skin pale and unadorned, but her eyes were fierce, and that was enough. The nurses began to treat me differently, not as a patient to be placated, but as a person with decisions to make. I had requested that all visitors be approved by me in writing, a clause that made the staff exchange knowing glances. "Family issues," I said once, when a young nurse hesitated to ask why. "We all have them," she replied softly, and for a brief second, we were simply two women who understood that family can be both a shelter and a knife. Then, slowly, the letters began. Not from Elaine, she was too proud for that, but from her son, my grandson Ben. The first one was cautious, written on the back of a notebook page in uneven handwriting. "Mom says you need rest. I miss you." I told her I'd pray for you anyway. The innocence of it struck me harder than any insult could have. I folded the note and kept it in the drawer beside my bed, next to the pen Grant had given me. Over the next weeks he wrote again, each letter longer, more curious, asking how therapy was going, telling me about school, about a science fair project, about the dog they'd adopted. I replied through Grant's office, keeping my tone light, never mentioning the shadow that hung over his mother. His letters were a lifeline, a reminder that not all branches of a tree grow crooked. By the third week, I could walk unaided for several steps. Marco clapped his hands like a proud parent, and I found myself smiling not out of obligation, but genuine relief. The body remembers how to heal once the mind stops begging permission. The hospital cafeteria became my new territory. Bland soup, thin coffee, conversations overheard between volunteers and patients about weather and grandchildren. I began to listen differently, not just to words, but to tones, to the way people spoke about those who cared for them or failed to. There was an older man in the next room who spoke daily to a daughter who called without fail, her voice always soft, always patient. Sometimes I envied him, not for the affection itself, but for the simplicity of it. I wondered if he knew how rare that was. One morning, I asked the nurse for a mirror. When she brought it, I sat holding it in my lap for a long time before daring to look. My face was thinner, older somehow, as if the weeks had peeled away not youth, but illusion. I thought of Elaine's face, smooth, composed, carefully curated like the rest of her life. And I saw how different we had always been. I had built myself out of work, of necessity, of days spent earning rather than inheriting. She had built herself out of avoidance, of image, of the belief that comfort was proof of success. And now here we were. I in a hospital bed rediscovering power, she outside the doors, furious that her reflection no longer matched the story she'd written. I started keeping a journal, thin lines of handwriting crawling across the pages in the unsteady scrawl of a recovering hand. At first, I wrote about the therapy sessions, the routine, the small victories of standing unaided or buttoning my blouse. But soon the entries turned inward, into questions about motherhood, about guilt, about the slow corrosion of love when it is taken for granted. I wrote without punctuation sometimes, as if I could outrun my own hesitation. One night, unable to sleep, I wrote, "She tried to end me because she thought I was finished. But maybe she needed me to disappear so she wouldn't have to see what she'd become." I closed the notebook and slept better than I had in months. Outside, spring was unfolding. Through the window, I could see cherry trees shedding their petals onto the courtyard pavement like pink confetti after a wedding. Volunteers came and went with trays of books, offering small talk and politeness. The world, it seemed, continued without scandal. Only I carried the secret of what had nearly happened, the knowledge that love can curdle quietly, that kindness can become strategy. The nurses assumed my daughter's absence was grief. They called it denial, a common phase. I let them think so. Sometimes it is safer to let others believe the wound is smaller than it is. When the hospital administrator came by to discuss my eventual discharge, he brought with him a file folder filled with forms and a polite smile. "We can arrange home care," he said, "or a private rehabilitation facility. The foundation you established covers the full expense." He didn't know that the foundation was my last act of control before the stroke, a reservoir of funds designed to ensure my independence long after Elaine thought me dependent. I told him I would decide soon. After he left, I stared at the folder for a long while, the weight of it heavy in my lap. Each signature would be another quiet declaration. I am not finished. That night, as I walked the corridor during my evening exercise, I caught sight of myself in the reflection of the glass doors at the end of the hall, a small, stooped figure in hospital blues, hair like white smoke, but upright, moving forward. I thought of the day she had said those words, "Pull her plug," and felt something inside me crystallize into resolve. She had wanted closure. I would give her continuity instead. She had tried to write an ending. I would give her a sequel. And as I turned back toward my room, the fluorescent lights humming softly above, I felt the strange exhilaration of a woman who has nothing left to prove and everything left to decide. By the time I returned to my bed, the ward was dark, the only light coming from the monitor's soft glow. I sat down, folded my hands, and whispered into the quiet air a promise that was not prayer, but intention. I would rebuild everything she had tried to dismantle, not for revenge, but for symmetry. If she had believed she could erase me, then I would make my life a permanent record. I would live loudly, even in silence. I would sign and write and breathe and walk until the very act of persistence became my language. And somewhere beyond the sterile walls of the hospital, my daughter would wake in her immaculate house, hear the faint echo of that persistence, and realize that the woman she had tried to unplug was now charging herself on her own current. When I finally left the hospital, the air outside felt heavier than I remembered, thick with the scent of rain and exhaust, the kind of air that clings to the skin like the past itself, refusing to let go. The nurse wheeled me to the curb, and for a moment I just sat there, watching people rush past, their umbrellas blooming and closing like impatient flowers. It was a weekday morning, ordinary for the city, but extraordinary for me, because every sound and color seemed to insist on my existence. A car horn, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant call of a street vendor, all of it reminded me that the world had kept turning while my daughter had tried to pause me forever. Grant had arranged for a car to take me not home, but to a small apartment near the harbor, a place I had owned quietly for years under my own name, a remnant from the era when I still believed in preparing for solitude. He called it a prudent investment. Now it felt like prophecy. The driver helped me into the back seat, and as we pulled away from the hospital, I glanced up at the building one last time. My name glinted on the plaque of the East Wing, the letters small but legible even through the drizzle. I wondered if Elaine had ever noticed it when she came to plead my erasure. Probably not. Children like her only see their parents when they need something reflected back. The car turned down a narrow street lined with sycamores just beginning to shed their leaves, and I watched them spin across the pavement like paper torn from an old ledger. I thought of all the records Grant and I had rewritten, the signatures rescinded, the permissions withdrawn, the legal knots untied. Every page felt like an act of resurrection. The apartment was modest but clean, a one-bedroom with a view of the water and a faint smell of salt that seeped through the windows. The furniture was spare, a sofa, a table, a lamp. But the quiet suited me. For the first time in years, there were no framed family photos on the shelves, no reminders of a past I had mistaken for loyalty. The first night I slept with the window cracked open, the sound of gulls drifting in with the morning tide. I woke at dawn to light spilling across the floor and felt, unexpectedly, alive. My legs ached from therapy, but the ache was honest, earned. I made tea slowly, savoring the small clatter of the kettle, and realized I had not prepared a meal for myself in months. Freedom, it turns out, is not grand. It is measured in the ability to decide when to boil water and when to stay silent. Grant visited a few days later to review the transition. He brought folders, letters, and a faint smile of approval. "You're already looking stronger," he said, glancing around the apartment. "I think this suits you." I nodded, though the quiet still unnerved me. He spread out the papers on the table and pointed to the sections that confirmed the transfer of authority. "All accounts are secured. The Foundation Board has been notified of your continued involvement. Elaine will receive formal notice next week that she no longer has access to your estate or medical information." I watched his pen trace the signatures and felt a slow warmth spreading in my chest. Not triumph exactly, but relief. "What happens when she finds out?" I asked. He met my eyes without hesitation. "She'll protest, perhaps publicly, but it won't matter. The law is clear." After he left, I walked to the window and watched the harbor fill with fog. The ships moved like quiet beasts through the mist, horns sounding low and mournful. I thought about the years I had spent being careful, restrained, invisible. I had believed invisibility was the price of peace, that self-effacement was another form of love. But in the sterile brightness of the hospital, when I lay beneath machines that spoke louder than my daughter's conscience, I had seen how dangerous it is to disappear on purpose. Now, in this small apartment filled with nothing but air and light, I could feel the edges of myself solidifying again. The following week, I ventured outside. The first few steps on the pavement were unsteady, my balance fragile, but the wind felt good against my face. I walked to the corner cafe, ordered coffee, and sat by the window. The barista was young, maybe 20, with a nose ring and tired eyes. She handed me my cup with both hands, as though offering something sacred. "You just moved here?" she asked, and I nodded. "Welcome, then," she said simply. And that was it. A greeting without motive, a kindness without agenda. I watched people come and go, their faces half hidden by scarves and hurry. Nobody knew me here, and that anonymity was its own kind of power. At night, I began going through the boxes Grant had delivered from my old house. Files, receipts, letters. Among them, I found a stack of birthday cards from Elaine, each one signed in the same looping script, each one impersonal to the point of parody. "Love you, Mom." No specifics, no warmth, just the obligatory signature of affection. I read them all, one by one, then placed them in the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened, releasing a faint sweetness into the air. It wasn't vengeance. It was housekeeping. A few days later, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something in me already knew. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom?" she said, her voice cautious like a child testing ice. "I heard you were discharged. I wanted to see how you're doing." I didn't reply at once. The silence stretched, and I could almost hear her shifting uncomfortably on the other end. "I'm fine," I said finally. "The doctors were excellent. I didn't mean for things to get complicated," she murmured. I was scared. "Of what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Of losing you," she said, and the lie was so smooth, so practiced, that for a second it almost sounded true. "You tried very hard to make that happen," I said softly. There was a small gasp, and then she hung up. The click was sharper than any slap could have been. That night, I sat by the window with a notebook, the same one I had kept in the hospital, and wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about fear disguised as love, about the way control masquerades as care, about how easy it is for gratitude to become obedience. I wrote about my mother, too, how she used to say that a woman's silence is the soil where other people plant their comfort. I had been generous with that soil, too generous, and now I was reclaiming it inch by inch. When I stopped, my hand was shaking, but my mind was clear. In the days that followed, small routines took root. Morning tea, a walk along the waterfront, letters to the hospital staff thanking them by name. Each act, though ordinary, felt like a declaration. I am still the author here. I even began reading again, something I hadn't done since before the stroke. The book was a collection of essays on resilience, though halfway through I realized I was reading not for inspiration, but recognition. The stories of survival were familiar, not because they were dramatic, but because they were quiet, built on small, stubborn choices, the same kind I was making every day. One afternoon, I visited the hospital wing that bore my name. I walked through the lobby unnoticed, my hair tucked into a scarf, my step slow but steady. The receptionist smiled politely without recognition, and that anonymity pleased me. I stopped before the plaque on the wall. The Eleanor Carter Rehabilitation Center, in gratitude for a lifetime of care and perseverance. I traced the engraved letters with one trembling finger and whispered, "Still here." The words echoed softly against the marble. When I turned to leave, a young doctor held the door open for me, and for a moment I thought it was the same one who had saved me, though perhaps that was just memory filling in mercy where it needed to be. As I walked back toward the harbor, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the wet pavement. People brushed past me, absorbed in their own worlds, and for once I didn't mind the indifference. I had spent a lifetime trying to be seen, to be understood, to be useful. Now, invisibility felt like liberation. I paused at the corner, breathing in the salt air, and realized that the midpoint of my life had not been the birth of my daughter or the death of my husband. It was this moment, this quiet turning where fear ended and ownership began. From here, I would not go back. I would not shrink to fit anyone's version of who I should be. The body heals in increments, but dignity, once reclaimed, returns all at once. That evening, as the tide came in, I opened the window wider and listened to the water slap against the pier. Somewhere below, the city hummed its indifferent lullaby. I thought of Elaine, of the silence between us now, vast as the ocean outside my window. Maybe she believed she had lost a mother. Maybe she would one day realize she had lost something rarer, a witness to her own better self. I felt no triumph, only an unfamiliar stillness, the kind that comes when a battle ends and you're the last one standing, breathing, watching the horizon without regret. I poured another cup of tea, wrote the date in my notebook, and under it a single line. Today, I began again, and no one had permission to stop me. The second escalation began quietly, the way aftershocks do, unseen at first, just a subtle trembling underneath everything I had rebuilt. It had been nearly 3 months since I'd left the hospital, long enough for the body to believe it was safe again, and the mind to start loosening its vigilance. I had fallen into a rhythm that almost resembled peace. Mornings belonged to tea and slow walks along the harbor. Afternoons were for reading, letters, and the satisfaction of managing my own affairs. Evenings I spent in the glow of the lamp, writing in my journal until sleep folded me into its soft indifference. I had not spoken to Elaine since that clipped phone call, and I thought, naively, I see now, that silence had drawn a final boundary between us. But silence to me was peace. To her, it was provocation. She mistook my stillness for an invitation to try again, to reassert control, to reframe the narrative of who was victim and who was cruel. It started with small signs. One morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door, no return address. my name written in her precise, expensive handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The same looping letters that once signed permission slips. The same signature she had scrawled on my medical forms when she thought I wouldn't wake. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a short note. Mom, please. I think we both said things we didn't mean. I'm worried about you. Let's talk before this gets out of hand. It was almost convincing, that calculated blend of remorse and superiority. But the phrase "before this gets out of hand" hung in my mind like a threat disguised as concern. Out of whose hands, exactly? I folded the note carefully, placed it in the drawer with Ben's letters, and said nothing. Some letters you keep not because they move you, but because they remind you of what you survived. The following week, Grant called. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the fatigue behind it. Elaine's been contacting the foundation board, he said, claiming you're unwell. She's suggesting a review of your capacity to manage finances. I sat very still, letting the words sink in like slow poison. She's persistent, he continued, but the paperwork is airtight. You've been medically cleared. There's no basis for her claims. Still, it's unpleasant. I thanked him, though gratitude felt too small a word for the mixture of rage and disbelief rising in my chest. It wasn't enough for her to have tried to kill me once. Now she wanted to assassinate my competence, my credibility, my right to exist on my own terms. For women like her, control is not about possession. It's about narrative. And she couldn't stand that I had taken back the pen. After we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the water darken under the evening sky. A freighter moved slowly through the harbor, its light steady, its motion deliberate, unbothered by the tide. I envied its certainty. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual and began writing letters of my own, to the board, to the hospital administration, to the scholarship committee that bore my name. I thanked them for their continued trust and reminded them, politely but firmly, that my involvement remained active and intentional. I copied every letter to Grant's office, ensuring there would be no gaps for Elaine to exploit. By the time I sealed the envelopes, my hand ached from the effort, but the ache felt righteous. Sometimes defense is the only form of love left. For a few weeks, things were quiet again. The weather turned colder, and the fog rolled in earlier each evening, muffling the world in its gray calm. I bought a thick navy coat from a small boutique on the corner, the kind of practical elegance my daughter used to mock as old-fashioned. I wore it proudly, a uniform of survival. The shopkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, complimented the color, and I found myself telling her more than I intended, about recovering from illness, about finding new footing, about learning to live alone without feeling lonely. She listened without pity, only nodding as if my story was one she had heard many times before. When I left, she slipped a small lavender sachet into my bag. "For calm," she said. "You look like a woman who's earned it." That night, I tucked it under my pillow and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. But peace never lasts when there are people committed to disrupting it. The second envelope arrived in early December, this one thicker, its edges creased from too many hands. I recognized the typeface before I saw the header. Notice of inquiry. The Foundation's legal department acting on concerns raised by family. I read the letter twice, 3 times, then set it down and laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that startled even me. She had found a new way to attack, not directly, but through the institutions I had built, the spaces where my name carried weight. The irony was vicious. She was using my legacy as evidence of my instability. According to the letter, there would be a review of decision-making processes to ensure transparency. They phrased it as standard procedure, but I knew Elaine's fingerprints when I saw them. I called Grant immediately. "We'll handle it," he said, his tone reassuring, but I could tell he was tired of fighting shadows on my behalf. I was tired too, but weariness is not defeat. It's just another form of endurance. The review was scheduled for January. In the weeks leading up to it, I busied myself with preparation, documents, statements, letters of endorsement from doctors and colleagues. I even rehearsed what I would say, though I knew I didn't need to. My truth required no performance. Yet beneath the calm I cultivated, anger simmered quietly. I kept wondering what she told herself at night to justify all this. Did she convince herself she was protecting me? Did she lie awake rehearsing eulogies for a mother still alive? Or was it simpler, more banal, the greed that grows when gratitude dies? I imagined her pacing her immaculate kitchen, glass of wine in hand, plotting how to regain control of the story. I almost pitied her. Almost. When the day of the review came, I dressed carefully. Dark wool dress, pearl earrings, the navy coat. I arrived early, walking slowly but without a cane. The board members greeted me politely, some awkwardly. Charity administrators are not trained for moral discomfort. I could see the unease in their eyes, the conflict between professional decorum and gossip. Elaine had clearly done her work. When the meeting began, I listened as they spoke of procedural concerns and ensuring stewardship. I let them finish, then unfolded my prepared notes, not to read them, but to hold as evidence of readiness. "Gentlemen, ladies," I began, my voice steady, "I appreciate your diligence. It's important to safeguard trust, but I assure you, no one understands stewardship better than a woman who built her own fortune in a world that once forbade her from signing her own mortgage." The silence that followed was clean and sharp, the kind that signals both discomfort and respect. By the time the meeting ended, the vote was unanimous. No changes. The review was closed. When I stepped outside, the air was brittle with cold, the sky the color of pewter. I stood on the steps of the building, breathing in the victory. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement that integrity, once tested, grows roots. I walked to the cafe down the block and ordered a black coffee. While I waited, I noticed a headline on the newspaper left on the counter. "Local philanthropist recovers after health scare. Daughter citees family reconciliation." My stomach tightened. The article was about me. I skimmed it, the words blurring into disbelief. Elaine had given a statement to the local paper, painting herself as the devoted daughter, the caretaker wrongfully misunderstood. According to her, we had reconnected privately and were moving toward healing. There was even a photo of her standing outside the hospital wing, hand pressed to the plaque with my name. I set the paper down slowly. It was a new kind of violence, the theft of truth. I called Grant again, and he sighed before I spoke. "I saw it," he said. "It's publicity. Let it die in silence." But I couldn't. It wasn't just about pride. It was about narrative, about being erased while still breathing. That night, I wrote my own statement, not to the press, but to the Foundation's newsletter. A short note of gratitude to the staff and to the countless unseen women who keep the world running quietly. I didn't mention Elaine's name, but the subtext was clear. The next issue printed it in full, my photograph beside it, alive and unmistakably autonomous. A week later, the paper ran a small correction. Sources close to the family declined further comment. That was her silence. I cherished it. But retaliation comes in many forms. In February, Ben wrote again, his letter shorter this time, his handwriting messier. Mom says you're angry. She says you think she tried to hurt you. I don't believe that. But I wish we could all be together again. My heart clenched. Children should never have to mediate the sins of their parents. I wrote back gently, telling him I loved him, that none of this was his fault, that truth takes time to reveal itself. I didn't send the letter right away. It sat on my desk for days, weighted with the kind of sadness that has no outlet. When I finally mailed it, I felt both relief and grief, as though each stamp pressed down a small goodbye. The last confrontation came not by letter, but in person. It was a gray afternoon in early March, the kind of day when light never fully arrives. I was returning from the market when I saw her waiting by the gate of my building, wrapped in a coat too elegant for the weather. For a moment I considered walking past, pretending not to see her, but avoidance had built too much of our history already. I stopped. "Mom," she said, her voice brittle, "you won't answer my calls." "There's nothing left to say," I replied. She flinched, then forced a smile. "I just wanted to see you. You look good." Her eyes darted over me, cataloging signs of frailty or strength, like a collector assessing damage. "You should have called before coming," I said. "This isn't your house." The words landed heavier than I expected. "I know," she said, almost whispering. "It was supposed to be, one day." "You had your chance," I answered. We stood there for a long moment, the air between us taut with unspoken history. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I wanted you to have this," she said. "It's from Ben." I took it, our fingers brushing briefly, and she recoiled as if my touch burned. "Goodbye, Elaine," I said, and turned toward the door. Behind me, she called out, "You'll regret freezing me out like this." I didn't turn. "I regret trusting you," I said, and the door closed between us with a final, merciful click. Inside, I leaned against the wall, trembling not from weakness, but from the release of tension that had lived in my body for months. I opened the envelope. It was indeed from Ben, a photograph of him holding a science fair ribbon, smiling, bright, unburdened. Beneath it, a note in his simple, honest handwriting. "I miss you. Don't give up on us yet." I sat on the couch and wept, not for loss, but for clarity. The line between love and harm is thinner than anyone wants to admit, but sometimes what survives on the other side of that line is purer, stronger. That night, I wrote another entry in my journal, my handwriting steadier now, almost graceful. They thought silence was surrender. But silence can also be strategy. Every time they spoke for me, I became more fluent in not needing to be explained. The next time they look for me in the stories they tell, they'll find only the echo of what they abandoned. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness settle, soft and complete. Outside, the sea kept breathing against the shore, relentless and alive. I thought of the doctor who had once said, "You're safe now," and realized safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of self. I had finally returned to myself, and though Elaine might never understand that, understanding was no longer hers to give. The culmination came not in a courtroom or a hospital ward, but in the quiet, deliberate ritual of a woman reclaiming the final pieces of her autonomy. It was early April, The city still caught between seasons, the air uncertain whether to offer warmth or chill. I woke before dawn, the horizon pale and translucent, and felt something inside me settle, a decision that had been forming in the background of my thoughts for weeks. I had been living defensively, bracing against Elaine's next maneuver, always expecting another intrusion disguised as reconciliation. But defense, I realized, is still a form of captivity. To be truly free, I needed to act, not react. The stroke had paralyzed my body for days. My daughter had tried to paralyze my will for decades. I was done with paralysis. I made tea, sat at the small kitchen table, and spread out the documents that Grant had prepared at my request. The folders were heavy, thick with signatures and clauses that spoke the language of permanence. In the weeks after our last confrontation, I had asked him to help me restructure everything: the trusts, the accounts, the foundation, even the ownership of my home. It wasn't enough to cut Elaine off. I needed to transform what she had seen only as inheritance into something she could never touch, something living, purposeful, untethered from bloodline or obligation. He had listened quietly as I explained my plan, his expression a mixture of admiration and melancholy. "Are you certain?" he had asked. "This will be irreversible." "So is betrayal," I replied, and that ended the discussion. The plan was simple but absolute. The entire estate, the savings, the properties, the investments, would be transferred into a charitable trust under my full control during my lifetime and managed by an independent board after my death. The beneficiaries would be women over 60 who had been left with nothing after caretaking for families who discarded them. They would receive housing, education, and legal aid. I had chosen to call it the Eleanor Fund for Invisible Women. The name made me smile, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. For years I had felt invisible, and now invisibility would become currency, a foundation for those still unseen. Elaine would receive nothing except the knowledge that the empire she had tried to claim had been redefined into something incorruptible. I signed each page slowly, my hand steady, the pen gliding over the paper with quiet certainty. The sound of ink filling the lines was strangely intimate, like breathing. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked around the apartment. The morning light stretching across the table, the faint hum of the kettle cooling on the stove, the lavender sachet by the window. There was no audience, no applause, just the calm pulse of completion. I thought of the hospital room, of the machines that had once measured my survival in beeps and graphs. This, I realized, was the same thing. Another rhythm, another declaration that I was still alive and sovereign. Grant arrived later that morning to collect the documents. He looked at me as one might look at someone who has crossed a river alone. "You've done it," he said softly. "It's official now. She has no claim." "Good," I said. "Now she can stop pretending to care." He hesitated before adding, "She won't take it quietly. You know that." I nodded. "She'll make noise, but noise doesn't change ink." He smiled faintly, the way people do when they've run out of arguments. Before he left, he handed me a sealed envelope. "Your copy," he said. "Keep it somewhere safe." I placed it inside the drawer where I kept Ben's letters and closed it gently. That afternoon, as if summoned by instinct, Elaine called. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was different this time, strained, brittle, as if she already knew. "Mom, I just got off the phone with the bank," she said without greeting. "They told me they can't discuss your accounts with me. What's going on?" "They're following instructions," I replied. "Whose instructions?" Mine. There was a pause, long and sharp. "You can't do this," she said finally, her tone rising. "It's irresponsible. You're not thinking clearly." "On the contrary," I said. "I've never thought more clearly in my life." She exhaled hard, the sound of a door slamming somewhere behind her. "After everything I've done for you," she began, but I interrupted her. "Everything you've done has been for yourself. Let's not pretend otherwise." Her voice cracked then, a tremor of real emotion breaking through the performance. "Do you hate me that much?" she asked. I closed my eyes, feeling the sting of tears I hadn't expected. "No," I said softly. "I don't hate you. Hate is still a form of attachment. I've just stopped waiting for you to be someone else." She was silent for a long time, and in that silence, I heard the faint echo of all our past arguments, all the ways love can curdle when it's never reciprocated. Finally, she spoke, her voice small. "You'll regret this." "Perhaps," I said, "but I'll regret it as a free woman." Then I ended the call. Afterward, I sat very still, my hands trembling slightly, the adrenaline of finality coursing through me. There was no triumph in it, only a deep, exhausted peace. I thought of all the years I had spent giving, money, time, forgiveness, and how generosity without boundaries becomes a form of self-erasure. Today, for the first time, I had given myself something instead. Closure. I poured a glass of water, took a slow sip, and felt the tremor in my hands begin to ease. Outside, the sky had cleared, the light sharp and clean. The world felt newly drawn. 2 days later, a courier delivered a letter from Elaine. I recognized her handwriting instantly, but almost didn't open it. Curiosity, or perhaps some stubborn maternal reflex, won out. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her tone oscillating between accusation and desperation. "You're destroying everything Dad and I worked for. You're humiliating the family. If this goes public, I'll make sure people know how unstable you've become." I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and wrote across the front in bold black ink, "Return to sender." Then I walked it to the nearest mailbox and dropped it in without hesitation. Watching it disappear through the narrow slot felt like closing a wound. Later that week, I received a call from the hospital director. He thanked me for an additional contribution I hadn't yet authorized. "It was the trust," he explained. "The paperwork just went through. You've secured funding for the next decade." His voice was reverent, almost shy. "Your generosity will change lives, Mrs. Carter." I smiled. That's the idea. When I hung up, I realized that what I felt wasn't pride, but relief. A quiet, expansive relief that the story no longer belonged to the people who had tried to write me out of it. That evening, I decided to visit the hospital one last time. The drive was long, the streets glimmering with rain, the world washed clean. When I entered the lobby, the receptionist looked up and smiled politely, unaware of who I was. I liked that. I took the elevator to the top floor, to the same corridor where I had once hovered between life and death. The smell of antiseptic and linen was the same. I paused outside the room that had been mine. Through the half-open door, I saw another woman lying in the bed, frail and pale, her daughter sitting beside her, holding her hand gently. The scene was almost tender. For a moment I envied them, then I pitied them, and finally, I forgave them. Not because they needed it, but because forgiveness was the last chain connecting me to that place. I turned away and walked down the hall, each step echoing softly in the sterile light. On my way out, I stopped before the plaque again. My name shimmered faintly under the lights. I reached out. touched the cool metal, and whispered, "Let it mean something this time." Then I left. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air was crisp with the scent of renewal. The sky was streaked with gold, and for the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down on my shoulders. When I returned home, I wrote one final entry in my journal. Today, I ended the inheritance of silence. Today, I built something that cannot be undone. They thought power came from possession, but power comes from authorship, from the right to define one's own story. I have reclaimed the last word. I closed the notebook, placed it beside the sealed copy of the trust, and exhaled. That night, I slept without dreams, the kind of deep, unguarded sleep that only comes after long captivity. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded across the water, low and steady, guiding itself through the fog toward open sea. I imagined myself aboard it, moving forward, unburdened, the past receding behind me like coastline. When I woke at dawn, light flooded the room, and I understood that I had not merely survived my daughter's betrayal. I had rewritten it into legacy. It was not vengeance, and it was not escape. It was authorship, the most radical act of all. The resolution did not arrive with fanfare, nor with the kind of cinematic closure that stories often promise. It came instead on an ordinary morning in late spring, when the sky was a soft white and the air smelled faintly of jasmine from the neighbor's balcony. I woke before the alarm, before the world had gathered its noise, and lay for a while listening to the faint hum of the city below. There was no particular reason for waking early. It was simply that sleep no longer felt like an escape. I was no longer running from anything, not even from memory. The apartment, once a place of exile, had become a place of rhythm and quiet purpose. The lavender sachet by my bed had lost its scent, but I kept it anyway, a relic of calm earned through endurance. On the table by the window lay the final version of the trust documents, neatly bound, embossed with the insignia of the foundation that now bore my name. The Eleanor Fund for Invisible Women had already begun its work. 2 women had received grants. One, a former caregiver whose husband had left her with debts. Another, a retired nurse displaced by medical bills. Grant had sent me their letters of thanks, each one handwritten in the looping, uncertain script of those who hadn't written anything but grocery lists in years. Their gratitude was awkward, unpracticed, almost painful in its sincerity. Reading them, I realized something profound. They weren't thanking me for money. They were thanking me for acknowledgement, for being seen, for being named as worthy of rescue. That, I thought, was the miracle of visibility. It could resurrect dignity even in strangers. In the weeks after the transfer, Elaine's silence became absolute. No more letters, no calls, no accusations filtered through lawyers or family acquaintances. She had withdrawn into whatever narrative she needed to tell herself to survive being excluded. I imagined her explaining to friends that I was unwell, or perhaps that I had been manipulated by opportunists. People like her cannot live without an audience, so she would have found one. The thought no longer wounded me. I had finally understood that indifference, not anger, is the true end of a toxic bond. The opposite of love is not hate, but the quiet decision to stop rehearsing pain. I had stopped. Sometimes, though, I caught myself wondering about Ben. His last letter had arrived months earlier, full of hope and confusion, and I had replied only briefly, careful not to force him into a conflict that wasn't his to carry. Then, One bright afternoon, as I sat in the cafe where I had begun to write again, a tall young man entered, holding a small bouquet of tulips. I recognized him at once. He hesitated by the door, scanning the room, then saw me and smiled, uncertain but genuine. "Grandma?" he said, as if testing whether the words still belonged to him. I stood slowly, and he crossed the room in 3 long steps, embracing me with the awkward tenderness of someone afraid they might break what they're trying to mend. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The years between us, the silences, the lies, the letters unsent, seemed to dissolve. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," he whispered. "That's all right," I said. "Sometimes the truth begins in secret." We sat for hours talking about small things, his studies, his music, his plans to move abroad. He didn't ask about Elaine, and I didn't mention her. Love can survive omission. When he left, he kissed my cheek and said, "I'm glad you woke up." The words were simple, but they landed deep. After that, I began to walk further each day, down to the harbor where the air tasted of salt and diesel. The ships came and went, indifferent to destination, and I took comfort in their repetition. I started volunteering with the foundation, not as a figurehead, but as a quiet counselor for the women who arrived, frightened and bewildered, unsure of how to begin again. Their stories were different in detail, but identical in pattern. Erased identities, children who no longer called, husbands who rewrote their pasts without them. I listened, I nodded, and sometimes I told them mine. Not all of it, just enough to let them know that reclamation was possible. Healing, I learned, is not an act of forgetting, but of renaming. We take what was once used against us and turn it into language. We make survival audible. One afternoon, while sorting through the Foundation's mail, I found an envelope without a return address. Inside was a clipping from a local newspaper, a short obituary for a man I didn't know, signed "Submitted by Family." Scrawled in the margin were 3 words in familiar handwriting. "I'm sorry, Mom." It was the first time she had written without manipulation, without performance. There was no signature, but I knew. I held the clipping for a long time, feeling neither victory nor grief, only a tender exhaustion. Perhaps she had finally understood that I hadn't destroyed her inheritance, but had liberated her from its poison. Or perhaps she had simply wanted to be seen one last time, as I once did. I placed the note in my journal between the last 2 pages and closed it gently. Some reconciliations happen in silence. That evening, I returned to the window and watched the harbor fade into twilight. The gulls wheeled above the masts, the tide pulled softly against the stone, and the city's lights blinked awake one by one. I thought of all the women I had been, the obedient mother, the silent benefactor, the patient, the survivor, the founder, and felt them settle inside me, no longer in conflict, but in chorus. The world had called me many things, but tonight I chose my own title, witness, not just to my pain, but to my endurance. I had witnessed the worst of love and the best of clarity, and both had shaped me into something unbreakable. Before bed, I opened the window wider, letting the night air wash over the room. I spoke softly, not to Elaine or to anyone in particular, but to the invisible lineage of women who had lived and vanished without their stories being heard. "They called me a parasite once," I whispered. "They called me a burden, but I am the root that grew back." The wind stirred the curtains, carrying my words somewhere beyond hearing, and I smiled. The next morning, I would return to the Foundation, sign another check, and continue the quiet work of restoration. But tonight, I allowed myself stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of completion. When I finally turned off the light, the reflection in the window was faint but unmistakable. A woman older, sharper, luminous with her own survival. I watched her for a long time, and for the first time in years, I recognized her without apology. The past no longer asked to be rewritten. It simply bowed its head and stepped aside, making room for what came after. And in that soft darkness, where betrayal had once lived, something gentler began to bloom, a peace not granted, but earned.